So we are coming up on a full year since we started this series on pocket pistols, which is only about 6 months longer than I thought it might last. Whenever I start a new series, I usually have a basic outline of topics, and then once I dig into it, I always come across things that I want to talk about that weren't a part of the original plan. In this case, I happened to find this old Smith Wesson 32 long snub nose at a local gun shop for a good price. And as I was looking at it, I just started thinking about how it's pretty similar to a modern J-frame on the surface, but if you consider all of the little details, it's really not the same at all. A lot of the most popular guns around today are based on designs that are decades old, and there's a lot we can learn by looking at how these guns have changed and evolved over the years, because those changes often tell us a story about the way people thought about marksmanship or concealed carry or even gunfighting and how those ideas have changed over the years. This revolver was made sometime around 1954 or 55. Collectors today would call it a pre-Model 30 because it was made before Smith & Wesson assigned model numbers to everything. At the time, it was just called a 32 hand ejector. The 1950s was a period when Smith & Wesson was making some new guns that would become game changers in the small frame subnose market. But this little 32 wasn't really part of that. It was more like a relic of the era that was passing. If you compare this gun to a modern J-frame, the first thing you might notice is that it's smaller. They are relatively the same size in most dimensions, but the cylinder and the cylinder window in the frame are about a quarter-inch shorter. That's because this is not actually a J-frame at all. It's an I-frame, which predates the J-frame by more than 50 years. Smith & Wesson launched their famous hand ejector line in 1896. That's the basic design that all of their revolvers are still based on today. The first one was a 32 hand ejector, an I-frame very similar to this one, only with a longer barrel. 3 years later, they came out with a 38 Special hand ejector, which was built on the slightly larger K-frame. That gun eventually became what we know of as the Model 10. Both revolvers were used and marketed as police sidearms, but a few decades into the 1900s, the 32 long cartridge was beginning to be considered underpowered for that role. So as 38 Special became more dominant, there was a growing market for a short-barreled, small-frame revolver in that caliber. Unfortunately, the I-frame cylinder was not long enough because it was designed for the 32 long cartridge, which, despite the name, is shorter than 38 Special. So in 1950, Smith & Wesson introduced a new frame size. The J-frame Chief Special was basically an I-frame with a longer cylinder and cylinder window. It only held 5 rounds of 38 Special versus 6 rounds of 32, but that did not stop it from being a massive success. In 1961, Smith & Wesson decided that they didn't need 2 different small frame sizes, so they discontinued all of the I-frames. Any 32s made after that point were built on the J-frame. The 38 Special J-frames were especially popular with police. In the 1900s, the handgun market was really driven by law enforcement, even more so than it is today. So a lot of these changes that we're going to talk about were made in response to what the police were saying they wanted as they carried and used these guns on duty. Even though this 32 was intended to be used for personal protection, like a lot of revolvers from that era, there are a few indications that it was designed by people who were mostly familiar with single-action target shooting. For most of the 20th century, police and anyone else who took handgun shooting seriously were most likely to practice and compete using some form of slow-fire bullseye shooting that encouraged thumb cocking the hammer for every shot. Now, there's evidence of that mentality when we look at the sights and the grips and the trigger and, of course, the presence of the hammer spur. Some of the modern J-frames also have a hammer spur, but most of the current models are double action only with the hammer concealed inside the frame like this one. You give up the single action feature to make the gun more snag-free and easier to draw. Smith & Wesson made the first so-called hammerless J-frame in 1952 called the Centennial, which came with a grip safety, which I think hurt its popularity. A few years after that, they introduced the original Bodyguard, a J-frame with a hammer spur that was shrouded only on the sides so the hammer could still be cocked manually. But even after these models came out, for a long time, most J-frames had the standard exposed hammer spur. I don't believe that really started to change until about the 1990s with the rise of the modern concealed carry movement. If you look at any current production J-frame, it's going to have a trigger with a smooth face. Back when this one was made, with most models, you had the option of getting a trigger with a serrated face. Now, it might have some advantages when you are shooting the gun single action and you're using the pad of your finger on the trigger, but shooting double action, you need more leverage on the trigger, and most people get better results if they use the first joint of their finger. If you hold up your hand and move your finger in a motion like you're manipulating a trigger, you'll notice that the whole first segment of your finger doesn't go back in a straight line. It moves along an arcing path. So with a good trigger press, your finger is going to kind of roll across the face of that trigger. Now, attempting that with a trigger that has a serrated face, it kind of sucks. And after that first box of ammo, it starts to feel like a cheese grater. I'm guessing that the serrated triggers were eventually dropped as a cost-saving measure, but the side benefit is that the smooth triggers make the guns much better for double action shooting. In profile, the fixed sights on this old gun really don't look any different from the fixed sights on a modern J-frame, but if you actually try to use them, you will immediately notice that both the ramp and the rear notch are much narrower. I think the assumption was that if you had to shoot at close range, you would just point shoot, and the sights were more for target shooting. The narrow sights give you more precision, so you can hit that bullseye out at 25 or at 50 yards. And I can confirm that this little gun is unbelievably accurate. Thanks to the inherent accuracy of the 32 long cartridge, it will shoot better groups than just about any handgun I've owned. But we have learned from the experience of people who have actually been in gunfights, and it turns out that sometimes sights are really useful even at close range if you can actually see them. So for close range defensive use, I would much rather have the wider sights found on the modern J-frames. Now, even those are not all that great, but the wider ramp and notch are much easier to see. With a little bright paint on the front sight, I do have a usable sight picture that I can acquire very quickly. And we've also got some new J-frames with pretty good fixed sights, like the bigger U-notch and white dot front sight on this Model 43C. One more sign of the fixation with single action target shooting is the grips. The factory checkered walnut stocks certainly look nice, but they aren't ideal for a defensive revolver. The main issue is that they don't fill this area behind the trigger guard. I'm told it's called the sinus. Today, J-frames come with many different types of grips, and there is a plethora of aftermarket options, but nearly all of them, to some degree, will fill in the sinus. That does a couple of things. First, it changes the orientation of your hand. With the original grips, your trigger finger has to kind of contort downward at an awkward angle, and if you want to shoot double action, you'll probably end up pressing on the very top of the trigger where the resistance is greatest. The grips on the modern J-frames lower your fingers and put the trigger finger closer to being in line with the center of the trigger. The other benefit of these grips is that they tend to fill most people's hands a little better, which is more comfortable, and it makes the gun easier to control because the grip won't shift around in the hand as much under recoil. Now, it's actually not fair to call this a modern innovation. Grips with this same basic shape, at least where it's filling in the sinus, they date all the way back to the 1920s or 30s, and before that, there were grip adapters that accomplished the same thing. Some people believe that the lower hand position was better for single action target shooting, not just for shooting the gun double action. There are a lot of other upgrades on the newer J-frames, like the larger angled cylinder release latch and the shrouded ejector rod. And around the time my 32 was made in the 1950s, Smith Wesson was first starting to experiment with lightweight aluminum alloy frames, and they have continued to push the envelope on using modern materials to make small frame revolvers as light as they can possibly be. And I think that, more than anything, is what keeps the J-frames relevant today. They can be as light as any pocket semi-auto, but they give you a little more grip to hang on to. Of course, I went into more depth on that topic on our pocket pistols versus snub nose revolvers video. You can find that and the rest of our pocket pistol series in the playlist that I will link to below, or you can get them all along with the full text transcripts on our blog at luckygunner.com/lounge. We are getting close to the end of our pocket pistol series, but we've still got a few more topics to cover before we wrap it up, so be sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss a thing.